It's time to paint up the Republic Sabre Tank for Star Wars Legion.
Welcome to Zorb Gaming, my name's Lachlan Linton Keane, and in this Star Wars Legion painting tutorial we'll be checking out the TX-130 Sabre Tank for the forces of the Republic. We'll be doing a classic Republic scheme, focusing on that striking red and grey hull armour, as well as looking at some simple stenciling, some battle damage, and some dynamic basing. So, let's dive in. First up, of course, is our assembly. Now, the Sabre Tank comes on a series of hard plastic sprues, so we're going to clip those off and assemble them all together using plastic cement. That'll give us a really strong bond, and there's a couple of little tricks here. You've essentially got the main chassis piece and then two wings, which then slot together, so as long as you follow the instructions, you won't have any troubles. One thing to note is that the two wings are positionable depending on how you want to pose your tank. There's the classic flaps down, or you can go with something a little bit more dynamic. I'm going to be doing a mid-strafe pose for my TX-130, so mine are going to be on slightly different angles. I've also kept the rear flaps, the guns, and the top turret assembly with our clone pilot completely separate, so we can paint those all for sub-assemblies. Just like in our Bark Speeder tutorial, I'm going to be working from a grey prime, which is going to become the base coat for my hull armour. I'm going to be using the Tamiya flat grey surface primer and giving a nice even coat all over the model. Once that prime has fully dried, we're going to dive straight into shading this model. I'm going to be using a Nuln oil Lahmian medium glaze. I usually work in 50-50, but when you're working on such broad flat panels like the Sabre Tank, the more Nuln oil you have in it, the dirtier it looks and the less consistent the pooling is. So, if you want a nice clean tank straight off the factory, then maybe drop that down to maybe 35-40% Nuln oil. I'm actually going to stick with the 50-50 because I want my tank to be pretty dirty and battle damaged and worn, and you'll see that even if you get a bit of extra pooling, that'll all smooth out with the dry brush later on. So I'm going to grab my Nuln oil glaze, I'm going to apply that all over the model. We've got the underside of the hull, all across the main armor, and all of our various components. The weapon assemblies, the rear flaps, every single piece of grey is going to get a coat here. Now we want to apply this glaze all over the model without allowing any part of it to dry before moving on to the next, so we get a nice smooth transition of pigment all across the tank. So a little trick for your application: if you hold the tank by the turret and glaze the bottom of the vehicle first, you can then take the flying stand that's supplied with the box, slot that into the grooves at the bottom, flip the tank over, and hold it by that flying stand whilst you paint the top of the tank. With all the other components, you've got little pieces to hold, like the barrel of the gun, which doesn't need a glaze, as well as the little joining knob on the rear flaps, and you should get a nice smooth pigment coat all over your armor paneling. So once that glaze is completely dry, we're going to finish off the grey armor paneling with a dry brush. I'm going to use the Citadel dry painted Longbeard grey. What I'm going to do is pry the lid off this paint so that I can get a nice large profile brush in there. A large brush is perfect for working on big areas like this because we can do it quickly but also get a really nice uniform coverage of our dry brush highlights. I'm going to load a bit of paint up on the brush and take most of it off on a piece of blotting paper, and then work in big sweeping circular crisscross motions all over the entire model. We're going to apply this quite heavily so that we get a really even and uniform coverage. It'll stick to all of the raised recesses and create a lovely highlight across all of these raised sections. But what we want to do is make sure we don't have too much paint on the brush, because while we overbrush and press quite firmly, that can create brush strokes and streaks and lines, which isn't the effect that we want. We want it really clean, really uniform, and this is going to pick out all of those lovely accented details. With that dry brush down, we've really created a lot of definition in the ablative armor paneling, even across some of the fold and crease lines on panels that aren't completely flat. There's a few regions where the wash was darker underneath, and with the dry brush that's gone over the top, it has smoothed those out, but those regions now look like a little bit more worn or a little more aged and battle damaged, which is exactly the effect I want for my tank fighting on Geonosis. Up next, we'll target the black detail with the Citadel contrast paint Black Templar. There's a lot of various black detailed elements all across the tank. We're going to start off by working on the exhaust vents on the side of the two wings, as well as those crossbars, and we're going to give those a nice uniform coat to make sure that they're evenly covered without too much pooling. Next, we'll do the two missile pod bays on the back side of each wing. We're going to apply the inside floor of the bay, as well as all of the support structures, and I'm also going to put Black Templar on the missiles themselves, except for the missile tip and the fins, which we're going to turn red later on. Then it's time to dive into our vents, and there are a lot of vents. This guy puts out a lot of exhaust, a lot of heat, and those engines need somewhere to vent that. So we've got a huge series of vents on the back of the Sabre, as well as on the back of the two wings. There's also an exhaust or an intake vent on the front of those engine housings, just in front of the missile pod, which we're going to hit with Black Templar as well. And then, of course, underneath there is a huge series of vents for those repulsor thrusters. So all of those ridged sections are going to get a lovely even coat of Black Templar. This is a bigger, flatter area, but all of the ridges allow the contrast paint to work really well. You just need to make sure you keep the contrast paint off any of the grey panelled edging that we've already dressed up and painted so perfectly with our glaze and our grey dry brush. The last black details on the main hull itself are the viewports. There are two larger ones and two smaller just above. If you're having trouble getting your Black Templar into the smaller ones, feel free to put down a coat of Nuln oil first and then drop the Black Templar into the center and let the Nuln oil carry the pigment throughout the entire viewport. There's also some black detail on our sub-assemblies, with the largest area being on the underside of the rear wing flaps. There's a huge repulsor vent there, so a nice even coat. Again, be careful to make sure you don't get any of the grey armor paneling. And then we have a huge black section on each of the barrels of our laser cannons. So make sure you're gently working that paint around, getting all of the beautiful detail there, and move nice and carefully up to the grey armor plating on the main casing around the laser. Then the final black detail is our pintle-mounted weapon up on the top of the turret. For me, I've gone with the beam cannon, but either weapon needs a little bit of black. Again, we want to let that Black Templar fully dry, and then we're going to dry brush all of those black regions to give them a nice industrial metallic highlight using Leadbelcher from Citadel color. So load up a bit of that silver on your brush, take the majority off on a piece of blotting paper, just like we did with the Longbeard Grey, and we're going to gently dry brush all over those machine components. Now, it's nice to work with this dry brushing pattern in a sort of straight line to create a bit of a machined industrial feel, rather than the circular kind of broad stroke motions we used on the armor paneling. So accenting the long detail features like the vents or the barrel will give you a really nice machined industrial feel. Once that Leadbelcher dry brush is down, our tank is ready to roll out of the factory and head on over to the paint workshop. Essentially, the base work that we've done so far can be the groundwork for any color scheme. I'm now going to apply my accent color, which is going to be a red, because I'm going for that classic cool red and grey Republic look, but you could swap that out for any color you like. Maybe a blue for the 501st or an orange for the 212th. No matter what scheme you're going for, all of the steps we've done so far are the perfect groundwork. So first up, I'm going to dive into my big broad red accent, and that's going to be using, as always, Flesh Terror's red contrast from Citadel color. The standard process for this whole layer is to block out the color with my layer brush, and then if I have any mistakes, I will gently caress those extra lines and straighten out the various accents with my fine detail brush. The layer brush has quite a broad head, so what I can do is load that up with the contrast paint and just applying firm pressure, drag the paintbrush across the surface of the tank, and it will leave a nice straight line. I'm going to hit all of the edges around the wing first, creating a lovely line accent that goes along the various edges of that front wing, and then there's also going to be a range of targeted panels across the vehicle. It's certainly easier if you map your color choices to particular paneled regions, but often when your stripes or accents go across panels, even though it's a little harder to paint, keeping that line straight across a perfectly flat region, it really looks more striking because it's obvious that the trim has been painted over the top of the armor paneling and that it's not a panel made of a material in that color. Once the wings are done, I've jumped onto the center of the hull and I've gone for a combination of accuracy and simplicity here. I've picked that center flat panel to be completely red rather than the half trim that it had, but also done some nice accents around the edges of the front of the hull. Once I've done the main hull, my sub-assemblies will have a few red details. I'm going to pick out the housing on the laser cannon with a red edging all the way around, as well as doing some lovely accent work on the rear flaps that matches the rest of my wings. The final red detail will be to accent the hatch and around the rim of the pintle-mounted weapon. So with that red contrast paint down, the vehicle is truly coming to life, but you'll notice that in contrast with the Bark Speeder tutorial, when we apply this red layer all over these large flat panels, it kind of loses a little bit of its luster. We need to accent it with some edge highlights. So what I'm going to do is mix up a profile of edge highlights using Scarlet Red, which is a nice cool red, keeping it in the cool theme, which is kind of a couple of shades lighter than the Flesh Tearer's red contrast. And I'm also going to mix a highlight gradient on my wet palette by adding some gray to that Scarlet Red to give me a couple of tones of lighter reds and pinks to accent with. Once I've mixed those out on my wet palette, I'm just going to grab my fine detail brush, load up a little bit of that Scarlet Red, and accent all of the various panels, hitting all of the red edges, anywhere there's a raised bump, and even really carefully taking my brighter red along the edge of those accents that are going across a flat panel. That helps really cement them and give them a little pop and makes the color really sing. Now, while I'm doing this with the Scarlet Red, I'm also picking little bits of my lighter pinks that I've mixed in that color gradient and adding those to various points as well. They don't have to be everywhere, just little kicks here and there to create a bright spot on the edge highlight, which gives you a really nice effect. It looks like light is hitting the various paint and shining on the most raised regions of the armor detail. So once those edge highlights are down, the red detail is really starting to pop and the color scheme is quite striking. But for anyone who knows the classic Republic color scheme of these tanks, there's one more color left on the palette, and that is our yellow detail. There's some quite complex accent paintwork that runs down each of the wings of the Sabre, and we're going to be using a technique called stenciling to make this super easy to look absolutely awesome. But the first thing I'm going to do is spray the entire hull and all of my sub-assemblies with a matte varnish. Now, I'm applying this to the entire tank so that it treats the paint exactly the same, and what this is going to do is create a nice protective barrier to allow us to do our stencil work. After you've applied the matte varnish, make sure you give it a good couple of hours to fully dry, and then I'm going to bring in some painter's masking tape and cut out a stencil with a nice sharp pair of scissors. Essentially, you just want to cut tiny little pieces of tape and assemble them in the negative, so you're leaving everywhere that isn't covered with paint in the region where you want your stencil to be. So as you can see, I've created that front triangle at the very front of the wing, and then created a thin line that works its way back, mimicking the shape of the wing until it hits the engine assembly with that lovely long line. So what I can do now is just grab a yellow color, paint it all over the blue masking tape, not worry where it goes, and then when I peel the tape away, you'll see that we have our fantastic painted detail underneath. So the first paint that I'm going to do is a nice kind of yellowy brown to create a lovely base tone to work from, because it's not a pure bright yellow, it's a dirty kind of rugged yellow. So I'm going to use Plague Brown from the Vallejo game color range, and I'm going to mix that with just a little bit of Lahmian medium just to thin it out a little bit. You could easily use water, and what this does is it makes the paint not gluggy. It won't have any kind of really obvious brush strokes because we're applying to a flat panel with that large triangle. It'll make sure we get a really smooth, even coverage. And while that's still wet, what I'm actually going to do is grab some more Plague Brown and mix in a little bit of a brighter yellow. I'm using the Sunburst Yellow or Flash Gitz Yellow from the Citadel color range, but any bright yellow would do. And I'm just going to mix again another little color gradient. By adding that yellow on my wet palette to the Plague Brown, I can create a series of brighter yellows, just like we did with the red, and then I'm going to come in with my fine detail brush and once again do a couple of little wet blended edge highlights while that darker yellow is still wet. So I'm just going to accent all of the various armor panelings that are obvious, like the joins between the panels, but of course, we have some wonderful stencil lines here. So what we can do is just take our fine detail brush and paint the edge of the blue stencil all the way along where we're joining our painted area, and that is going to be the easiest way to create edge highlights all along the very edge of our painted region, so that when we peel away the tape, there'll be a little kick of brighter yellow before it goes back to the grey. Now the final trick is of course to pull away our stencil, and I'm actually going to do that before the paint dries, and you'll see why in a second. So rip that off, which is quite a therapeutic action indeed, and you can see that we have a fantastic shape there, but it's a little messy in some areas because sometimes the paint slides around and sneaks under the masking tape. Maybe it wasn't fully pressed down, but because the paint is still damp, we can come in with a wet brush or a cotton bud and really work on that region. The varnish is there to protect the paint underneath, so we can rub back and forth until we pick up all of the bled pigment that has got onto the armor paneling where it shouldn't. And then once we've cleaned that all up, we have a really fantastic yellow detail. Our final colour layer will be to apply some Basilicanum grey contrast paint all over the antenna, just to give them a slightly different colour profile to all of the black detail, and then our final colour work on the hull is finished. So there we can see a fantastic looking colour scheme on our Republic tank, but I of course love to take it one step further and create some character and some battle damage. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab my technical paint from Citadel, Typhus Corrosion. This is a really awesome paint for creating grime or rust or just kind of oily smears. It's really fantastic on all sorts of industrial models. So what I'm going to do is apply this in a range of regions around the model for slightly different purposes. All of my grills and my vents, I'm just going to load some up into all of the recesses like there's a buildup of working grime, and then on some of the flat areas near those vents, I'll load up a little Typhus Corrosion on the edge of those vents, right on the grey region, and then take a dry brush and just streak that Typhus Corrosion all over the grey. That'll create a lovely stain on the armor paneling that's been hit by all the exhaust fumes and industrial lubricants leaking out of the engine components, and if it ever gets too strong or it's smearing way too much, just take your thumb and rub it over the surface and it will pull all the Typhus Corrosion away off the highest regions and leave it in the recesses. I'm also going to load this up into all of my kind of underneath grills, all of my repulsor paneling that's all blackened and silver highlighted, and just get a whole bunch of Typhus Corrosion in all of those recesses underneath, because there's a lot of grime going on in those repulsor engines underneath. So I'm loving the grime build-up. It's looking like a fantastically well-used vehicle, but of course this is a tank. We need to see some battle damage. So what we're going to do is create the effect that some of the paint on various regions has been chipped away by shrapnel or enemy laser blasts hitting the hull. So what I'm going to do is take a darker grey Stormvermin fur by Citadel color, and I'm actually going to apply that to the model using a sponge. So I'll load up a little bit of paint on my sponge and then take most of it off, and take quite a lot off as well, just onto your palette or something, and then I'm going to gently dab my sponge on various regions on the tank. Now remember here, less is more, but essentially what we're doing is we're creating the illusion that the brighter armor color has been chipped away to show the original prime that was done in the factory underneath. I've picked a couple of regions on the front hull, up on the turret, some on the wings, and just apply a few dabs of grey all over those regions. Then I'm going to repeat that exact same process with some Leadbelcher to create some silvery glimmered highlights in those same regions. This is a technique we use on World War II and 40k vehicles all the time to show that the paint has chipped away so much we can see the steel underneath. Now of course Star Wars vehicles aren't actually made of steel, but it still creates a really nice highlight. Maybe there's some shrapnel still lodged in the armor, or the laser bolts or the fusion blasts have been so hot that it's been scorched and melted and developed a little bit of a sheen. Either way, it looks absolutely fantastic as a little accent to truly highlight that battle damage. Now, of course, the final step is to paint our clone pilot. I've just done that using the exact same techniques I've outlined in my clone trooper painting video, which I'll link above so you guys can check that out if you haven't seen it already. And then our tank is ready to go. We can assemble all of our various sub-assemblies, and he's looking absolutely fantastic. Now, I'm going to be doing my classic Geonosis basing scheme with this model, and what a base it is. It's absolutely huge, and that base size is the thing that got me most excited to do a dynamic pose. Now, because I'm doing this crazy mid-strafe pattern, I'm going to be using a custom flying base by just grabbing some acrylic rod. I've dremeled that down at the top to create a lovely crossbar that still fits with that normal cross pattern that's mounted underneath for the traditional flying base, and then I've drilled that into the base and mounted it underneath with a washer so it's nice and secure. I can go in detail on how to do complex basing like this in another tutorial. If you guys are keen, let me know down in the comments below. And then from there, I've just built up a lovely Geonosian profile by putting down some scorched brown all over the base and then applying my Mars Earth base ready mixture, which you can get from my online store zorbasorb.com. The first step is to put down some Geek Gaming Ready basing glue. I'm going to apply that all over to the base except for the arc lines so that we can still see those once the basing material is down, and then just pour on your Mars Earth. It comes with a mix of sands and aggregates and different gravel sizes so you can create a really cool looking Geonosis surface. Once that's fully dry, we're going to brush off all of the excess, in particular brushing out those arc lines so that they're really obvious, and then I'm just going to give those a little highlight with Plague Brown. They start off as a really lovely Marsy red, but I just want to elevate it to that lovely Geonosis orange. So plague brown all over the base, and then the final highlight will be to grab some khaki, and we're going to create a little illusion of sunlight by just dry brushing the regions that aren't directly underneath the Sabre Tank. So all along the edges of the base ring, and more favoring the side that my tank is strafing away from, the side that's more open to sunlight, and that creates a really nice realistic profile for a lovely Geonosis surface. So I am absolutely stoked on this model. I think it's really great fun to paint. It's something obviously that's a little bit different from the Star Wars Legion units for Clone Wars we've seen so far, and it looks so dynamic in this pose, and I love the way that the kit's got so much detail, and it presents a really unique opportunity to test out some new skills as well. So I really hope you guys enjoy painting this one at home.
The Sabre Tank has a really special place in my heart. I spent about a decade of my childhood in Battlefront 2 just like strafing left and right and blowing away clankers and rebels, of course, as well. So I'm super happy to finally see it here on the tabletop for Star Wars Legion. I do have a second one just over there, so if you guys are keen to see some alternate paint schemes, maybe for different legions, we could look at the 501st or the Utapau 212th, maybe some Kashyyyk stuff. Definitely let me know down in the comments with any suggestions or any feedback you've got on the video at all. I would always love to hear it. And if you're happy with what I'm doing here and enjoying the content and want to support me, feel free to head on over to my Patreon. Patreon is absolutely huge for this channel. It's the backbone of why I'm able to make all of these videos. So thank you so much to all of my patrons for supporting me, and we'll see you next time right here on Zorp Gaming. Cheers, guys.